Of course, you'll recognize this as the 356 Silver Bullet. I obtained this one in an estate sale, and it was in pretty poor condition. But there was one thing I recognized when I first took a look at it, was the front truck area, the pilot truck. And I'm going to focus down on it. Now this one has what I previously described as the nomenclature of a pilot truck and strap. Let me get something that my finger won't get in the way of showing you where I'm pointing to. That being the strap right there. It has two screws on it, one on either end, that holds this in. And you can see the top of the spring. I noticed that when I started rebuilding this, the previous owner had inserted a weight right here in the bottom of the pilot truck. Well, I knew that that was not part of the normal construction technique or process for American Flyer trains. At least I'll stand my ground on that right now. I haven't found any reference to it anywhere. So I thought, well, maybe the owner did that just for the heck of it, just wanted to quieten this truck or some reason. I didn't see it as necessarily staying on the track as much, but that's probably what it served as. I noticed that the spring was missing, and I wondered why they didn't do the right thing and put a spring in rather than a weight. Well, I took the weight out knowing it was not part of the normal A.C. Gilbert construction technique, and left this pilot truck freely hanging from its strap without a spring. After I rebuilt it, I began operating it on my layout and noticed that this guy had the classical symptoms. It began to derail without any consistency, if that makes any sense, in varying degrees. For example, sometimes it would come around after running for 10 loops, it would suddenly come around with the front axle off the railhead, kind of pushing the pilot along at an angle. Put it back on, it might run a half a day or until the next day and never move. Next day, it might do it on every trip around the loop. It would come back in front of me, it would be off. I saw it come back around at times with this turn completely sideways, dragging it. I saw it short out across the rails in this configuration. I saw this train with some pretty catastrophic wrecks simply because in this position, and for whatever reason, it was snagging, maybe on a tie or some sort of structure, accessory structure that was close by the rail. For example, the barrel loader is really close, although I don't remember it being that particular one, but I think you get what I mean, that if this thing is protruding and being pushed along, it could be in any position and it might snag anything that's close to the track. This is kind of a wide locomotive, by the way. I hope I wasn't blocking that, but it was either in this position or this position. Well, I spent an inordinate amount of time going around the track. And that might have included derailments when either ascending a grade change or descending a grade change, especially when it transferred back to no grade at all. So I spent just an inordinate amount of time looking at the track and not looking in the right places. I was feeling along the track, I was looking at switches, because sometimes it seemed to be related to switches, and I was just going on and on and on about where this was occurring until I finally decided that maybe, after looking in the factory service manual, it was that missing cone spring right there. If I were to name the items that seem to consistently be missing from trains that I rebuild, whether they be from a customer or out of my own junk box or from estate sales, it seems to be very consistent that that spring is missing. Now you can go back through the factory service manuals, and apparently there were some trains in which they, for some reason, thought they weren't needed. I don't think my 282 had one, but I went back and noticed that the truck platform sits really close to its attachment point. That is, this little slot that it runs up and down. I don't know that you could squeeze a spring in there. I'd like to have one, but you have to reduce the size of the spring as I did with this one. I don't know why people didn't replace them. There could have been several reasons. One, they didn't know where to get them, or they didn't know where to put them on. If by chance the structure, the assembly technique, uses a screw, a flathead screw like this, then it's pretty easy. You simply unscrew this. You have access to the washer, access to the spring. You drop them back in. You screw it back together, and it should work. Paying attention to putting the small end in the tightest area. For example, on this one, I would put the spring, the tight end, down, which is what I see it in most factory service manuals, although I'm not claiming that is the best way. I believe this one came reversed. They've got the wide end was down against the platform, and the small end was up against this slot with that washer in place. It seems to work just fine. But this one is the easiest one to replace. But what do you do if you can't get this out and it's not a flathead screw? It is in fact a stud that is permanently bound to the truck assembly through crimping. Well, Mr. Barker says that you can drill it out as you can do on any kind of rivet, then replace it with a screw. And that, of course, amounts to finding the screw, finding the one that's the right length, and then developing the threaded area right here to put it back down in there. But what I found is that there is a trick to doing this. If you don't want to take the stud out, what I learned to do was to separate the spring at one end, as you see this one, and thread it onto the stud. Now it's tedious, it's a little time consuming, it requires a special tool that you probably already have anyway, but it is possible. And I found that if I would just be patient and thread this thing onto the post, if you can envision the post or the stud being squeezed into that open area. Let me see if I can get this turned back around to where you can see it. Yep. First, feed that open area around the stud and then grab the other end of this and pull it around this way in a clockwise motion, that eventually you can thread this onto the stud. Using your hands will work up to a certain point, and then I found that it was most handy to have some really good, strong, pointed-ended tweezers that I could grab a hold of the spring and simply keep rotating it around, feeding it little bits and pieces at a time. Now, it gets a little tedious and tight when you get down here to the bottom of the spring, but it's not impossible. So I found that you can get these springs on with a stud, but of course, Mr. Barker does provide an alternative. So I guess the lesson learned for me was that I was looking in all the wrong places. I didn't understand the cause and the impact, and I didn't understand the mitigation. I was spending way too much time on looking at the track when this operating without springs and bouncing too much and coming off the railhead at certain places. I mean, there's no reason to get rid of the bounce. It's going to be there forever. And looking for it, you'll probably never find it, or it's going to be very challenging to find because you can't push one of these trains along and get the same effect as it running under its own power. This coming under just a slight bump was enough to jar it off the railhead, turn it a little bit, get it hung on one of the flanges, and then goes from there. Anything's possible. Whereas with a spring, excuse me, with a spring like this, just enough pressure to put on the railhead to keep this guy bound to and sitting on top of the railhead. So again, you can spend an ordinate amount of time looking for the root cause, but if you recognize that simple or catastrophic derailments are occurring with no pattern in location or frequency, one of the first places I would go back is to check the entire structure of this truck in the presence of a spring. Thanks again for watching Dave's American Flyer Trains. So long, everyone.